So we are going to move on now, and I'm going to introduce Sarah Porter, and we are going to start talking about water. Okay, so Sarah is the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at ASU Morrison Institute. So the Kyle Center basically promotes research, analysis, collaboration, and open dialogue to build consensus support around sound water stewardship solutions for Arizona and the West. Prior to this being the director of the Kyle Center, she was the state director for Audubon and led the Western Rivers Project. Prior to that, she spent 14 years in private practice as a commercial litigation attorney. Oh goodness, Sarah. I wonder if you like that. Good for you. And so she serves on Governor Ducey's Water Augmentation, Innovation, and Conservation Council, U of A's Water Resources Research Centers, External Advisory Council, and several other community boards. She is involved in a lot of things around water. She's a native Arizonan, yay! And she has a bachelor's with honors from Harvard and her JD from ASU. Glad you went to ASU. Glad you're working for ASU. I'm a little partial. So help me welcome Sarah. So it looks like you've already got your screen up, Sarah.
Ready to go. Thank you so much, Sharma. You know, I loved your story, Sharma, of your coming to be aware of how important agriculture is. I had a similar journey when I was working for Audubon. The National Audubon Society had leadership that thought it was really important to work with the land managers, with people who are on the land. And that gave me a chance to get more familiar with how people who are actually on the land think about it. As I've moved into spending all of my time on water policy, something that I often have the chance to say to, let's say, more urban-oriented audiences is that, to my mind, the top 3 uses of water are hydration, sanitation, and nutrition. And I always challenge people to tell me of a more important use than hydration, sanitation, and growing food. So far, I haven't heard of one that was more important than those 3 things. So I certainly understand and respect the role of water for our food systems. I also want to say it's so nice to be on a call with Andrew Smallhouse. Stephanie is certainly a really important voice for water and agriculture in the state of Arizona, and I've enjoyed being on the Governor's Water Council with her and working with her on some other things. And I appreciated your sharing the mission of the Kyle Center. Let me add that the Kyle Center is part of Morrison Institute, which is an almost 40-year-old think tank at ASU. It was funded by the Morrison family. I'm sure many on this call are familiar with the Morrisons, an old farming family in Arizona. And it's as part of our work, doing policy work, we're guided by the principles of remaining nonpartisan, that our work should be fact-driven, data-driven, and finally, that our policy conclusions and recommendations need to be in the historical context. We need to remember, whenever we're thinking about policy recommendations, where we've come from. And so I think that historical context is especially important in the area when we talk about water policy. So today I get to talk with you about a subject that I spend a lot of my time on, and that is Arizona stream adjudications. I thought what I'd cover today is, what are they? Almost everyone on this call, I'm sure, has some idea of what they are, so we won't have to belabor that. We'll talk about why they have taken so long. We'll do a shallow dive into the question of subflow, which is one of the most kind of tenacious problems in the adjudication, and then why the adjudications matter and what can we do about the adjudications. I love getting questions. It's probably going to be a little hard for me to read the chat, so unmute and try to interrupt me if you have a question to ask as I go. And then I should also say that timing is so perfect in this work from home world. Right now, as I speak, our refrigerator repairman is coming, bless his soul. Our refrigerator gave out last night, and he was able to find the time to come and help revive our 22-year-old fridge. So if there's a little barking in the background, I do apologize. I might have to take emergency action. So let's talk about what the adjudication is. So in Arizona, surface rights are very special, and they're special because we recognize surface rights according to the doctrine of prior appropriation. That's a special rule developed for the West. In the West, where water is relatively scarce, the Southwest, I should say, we need a very clear way of making sure that who has what water rights. And so we came up, I say we, in the 19th century, a court in California first articulated this rule, which said the first person to come along and divert water and put it to beneficial use has a right that is senior to people who come later. And you can just imagine why this makes sense. If you come in and you divert water from a stream, let's say to develop a mine, that first case was about a mine, or to irrigate a farm, then you shouldn't be, you should have the certainty that someone else can't come along upstream and divert water away from that you were counting on. So I think of the rule of prior appropriation is a rule of economic certainty. It's definitely a rule that is rooted in economics. People need to have certainty in order to engage in economic activities. But in order to give out those rights, to allocate those surface water rights, we have to attach these special attributes to them. Every surface water right needs a priority date. It needs a quantity. In other words, how much is allocated. Some rights have special attributes related to quantity. For example, a return obligation where they divert the water off, but only to irrigate, and they need to return what's left back into the stream. We need a point of diversion and a kind of use. So those are all the special attributes of surface water rights. And so the way the adjudication, what an adjudication is all about is implementing this idea of economic certainty. If you have a whole bunch of people moving into a watershed and starting to compete, starting to reach the limitations of the allocation of that watershed, that's the point at which you really need to know who has what right with what priority and quantity and point of diversion and use. And so the rule of prior appropriation sort of assumes that someone has kept track, that there's some big catalog of rights from senior-most to junior-most, but the reality is that cataloging needs to take place in a proceeding where people have a chance to assert their rights and assert evidence to support their rights. Other people have a chance to contest that assertion of a right, and that is all happening in Arizona's 2 stream adjudications. So I think of the adjudications as a big cataloging of all of the surface water rights in the watershed. So our 2 big adjudications are the Gila watershed, and in that there are, I think I have a pop-up on this. Let me see if I can make this work. Yep, the Gila watershed adjudication started in 1974. There are 40,000 parties in this adjudication, 85,000 or so claims asserted. That means that some parties are asserting more than one claim because they have multiple points of diversion or uses or for other reasons. Now these parties run the gamut from federal claimants, including BLM, US Forest Service, other federal agencies, tribes, state lands, ranchers, farmers, cities, and lots of small claimants for either domestic use or small amounts of irrigation or stock watering ponds. In fact, in the Gila adjudication, 92% of those 85,000 claims are for less than 250 acre feet per year. That's a lot of water for someone like me who lives in the city of Phoenix, but that's a modest amount of water, less than 250 acre feet per year in the scope of the adjudication. In the Little Colorado adjudication, it's not quite as big an adjudication in terms of claims and claimants, But again, it's an even higher number. 97% of claimants are asserting rights to less than 250 acre feet per year of water. In the HELA adjudication, about half of little guys, those less than 250 acre feet per year, are asserting claims for residential use, and the other half are for stock pond or irrigation. In the Little Colorado adjudication, it's about a third of those little guys, so 97% of claimants, about a third of that 97% are asserting claims for their own residential use, and then the other 2/3 are for irrigation and stock ponds. And that's such an important, I mean, I'm belaboring this point because what we need to think about when we're the adjudications is that a lot of little guys and gals are impacted. It is a critically important proceeding for them. So why have the adjudications taken so long? Well, for good reasons. First of all, the adjudications deal with the most important resource in our state, and the most important because it is the scarcest. We've got a lot of sunshine, we've got a good amount of land, but we don't have all the water for all of the things that people want to do. And when you have that kind of those kinds of facts, it means that you're going to have huge foundational legal questions presented. So in the beginning, there were big questions about whether the state court could have jurisdiction over federal claims, the claims that were being asserted by tribes and federal agencies. And in fact, the namesake for the Kyle Center, Senator John Kyle, who was a water lawyer before he entered Congress, argued before the United States Supreme Court on behalf of the parties in the adjudication who wanted the adjudication to be kept in one court, and prevailed in that case. But there was a push by some parties to have the federal claims tried in a federal court instead of in a state court. Those issues got resolved, and then we moved on to of important ground rule cases. Over a series of 20 years, the courts from all the way from the trial court, and then the appeals court, and the Arizona Supreme Court would have to review these very important questions of the ground rules of the adjudication. And so the way I think of them is about half of them are about subflow, and about half of them are about issues related to tribal claims. We can go into details. I don't think we'll talk more about subflow, but that's all to say it takes a long time for these issues to be resolved. The good thing is there are only a couple of big issues like this left to be resolved, and they're on their way to being resolved. And it means that it's done once and for all for the state of Arizona when these issues are resolved. Of course, when any of these questions is resolved, there are impacts for the parties in terms of their, the strength of their claims. But at the same time, there's also the benefit of certainty for everyone. I always think we can solve the water issues in the state if we just know where everyone stands. But when we don't know where everyone stands, we can't even begin to address the water issues. And then finally, another big reason why it's taken so long to resolve the adjudications is that at the beginning of the adjudications, there were a whole bunch of tribal water rights claims that had not been resolved yet. So under the Winters Doctrine, which I assume many of you have heard about, it's a doctrine that says that when a reservation is created, there is a set aside of water necessary to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. This is a doctrine that it was explicitly developed by the US Supreme Court for tribes. It's from the 19th century, I think, or early 20th, but it also applies to national forests and other types of federal land reservations, essentially. And so, but it's left up to the tribes to go and pursue their water rights claims just as it is for any other water rights holder in the adjudication. And to resolve a a tribal water rights claim usually involves a very complex settlement with multiple parties. It very often, almost inevitably, involves federal legislation. And one of the big reasons for the necessity of federal legislation is because when tribes have their water rights allocated, they also need funding in order to develop a use for that water right. So they usually want to build into a settlement funding, federal funding of some kind or another, to enable them to develop infrastructure and other the other things they need to use their water rights. So to date, we have 22 tribes in Arizona, 7 tribal claims are fully resolved. The Colorado River Indian tribes claims were adjudicated back in 1963. It's the only adjudicated water right where the US Supreme Court said what their water
Sarah, you there? All right, everybody, this is the fun stuff we get to deal with technology issues. Let's see if we can get her back.
It must be
Sarah?
the refrigerator.
Oh, yeah, maybe the dog started barking. I was gonna say, I didn't know if my dogs would start barking when I was talking either. Sarah, you there? Oh, let's see if we can get her back on. Hold on, everybody, be patient. This happened at our last webinar too, so apparently technology is. All right, let's see.
Sharma, maybe she called just a 5-minute bio break. There you go.
All right, let me see if we can, she's probably gonna be logging back in any second. Hold on, be patient, everybody. I'm gonna. You guys, I think we're having issues and I'm gonna have to email her. I don't wanna cut up in the middle, but I was thinking, what if Bailey, I don't know if you wanna talk for a few minutes. We don't wanna cut Sarah off in the middle, but it might take her a few minutes to get back on. What do you think, Bailey?
I'm happy to, or we can hold off a couple minutes, however.
Let's wait.
Feeling. I don't know if we want to take a short break.
You know what? Let's wait just 1 minute. I'm trying to reach her via email, and then if she doesn't, we'll see. Maybe she's having some issues. See, I mentioned to everybody, if the internet goes out, our computer freezes, we just can't help all this stuff. So what we have to deal with, unfortunately. Hold on, you guys. I'll go get her via email and call her.
I lost Bill.
So there are many folks on the line here who've had direct experience dealing with the adjudication so far. How far along are you in that process, and what does it look like for you?
We've been dealing with it for about 40 years, I guess. So,
well, all right.
So there's several. There's one of the surface water adjudication, and that's why it's complicated. And then there's the groundwater adjudication through the state, which hopefully she'll get back on and explain it.
Yeah.
I'm not very good as Bill. I can get my wife on here. She's pretty good at explaining it.
You feel like the surface water has been moving along fairly well for you?
Yeah, the surface water, you're more secure with the surface. If you have surface water, right, you're a lot more secure. It's the land that you don't have surface water rights for. And that's the gray area because there's not a lot of there's not grandfathered rights on the groundwater as though there is on the surface water. So that's why it's been hard for the judge to decide a lot of these issues, because supposedly the state of Arizona owns all the groundwater. So our farm, we have about a third of it we have enough surface water for about a third of it, and about 2/3 of it is groundwater.
Okay. So I imagine a lot of that hang up is just identifying which of that is subflow. Is that right?
Well, they're considering it all subflow because if you're in that red line that they drew, then it's all considered. So that's the hard thing. So you basically, if you don't have this surface water, right, then if it's good, so that's the debate, is whether it's surface water, I guess, or subflow or groundwater. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's I'm not. It's too complicated.
Yeah, I know. Sarah left us off right there, so she left us on the edge of our seat.
Okay, you guys, hold on. We got her. Hold on. Oh, and Bill somehow. Sarah?
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. That was a disaster. That was our disconnect between a refrigerator repair and the need for Wi-Fi. So I really apologize for that.
Well, just so you know, I was getting them totally confused while you were gone.
Well, thanks. And I was assuming you could all hear me screaming. I don't scream very often, but when I do, it's loud. So I really apologize for that. I'm sorry.
We didn't hear you screaming.
I thought everyone in the state could hear it. I'm so sorry about that. So I was going to talk about subflow. Should I proceed? Any questions at this point? Okay, hearing none, I'll proceed. So this issue of subflow is a big issue in the adjudication, and it's one of those ground rules cases that has come up now 3 times to the court. The issue is wells near rivers. That's what we're talking about. And we have the rule of prior appropriation for surface water, but of course we have a separate rule in the case of groundwater. We have the rule of the doctrine of beneficial use. You can, and you are within your right, if it's your land and you're not in an active management area, to drill a well and use the water that you pump out for a beneficial use. Now, these 2 rules, the rule of prior appropriation for surface water and the rule of beneficial use for groundwater, come into conflict when we're talking about wells that are adjacent to streams and may be pumping out the subsurface flows of the streams. And our shorthand term for subsurface flows in Arizona is subflow, and that's what we're talking about here. We needed the court to provide clarity over how should we think about this water that would be reaching a river and be part of the flows of a river, but it's being interrupted by a well for the purposes of the adjudication. And so the court, it went up to the Supreme Court and down and up and down and up. And then the Supreme Court said, we have a rule. And I just have a quote here where they're saying, it's very important to have a rule about subflow because much turns on it. I have maps of the state of Arizona over which we've imposed the Wells 55 database from the Department of Water Resources. And you'll see that we have a tendency in our state to drill wells near rivers. So it is a pretty big issue. So the Arizona Supreme Court in 2000 declared that subflow is water that's found in this part of the geography of a watershed called the saturated floodplain Holocene alluvium. And that makes perfect sense to everyone, right? It is the Holocene alluvium is the latest, the youngest layer. If you think of layers of the earth, I'm not a geologist, I'm a lawyer, so you just trust me on this. And so it is the more recent layer, it's more porous than layers underneath. And the court said that the part of that layer that's saturated is the subflow zone. And they said also that, so they said all of the wells that are in that saturated floodplain Holocene alluvium, what we think of as the subflow zone, are subject to the adjudication. In other words, the well owner needs to get into the adjudication and assert a claim for water use just the same as if it were a surface water right. We're going to treat water withdrawn from wells in the subflow zone as surface water. And the court said, and that also wells that are in the cone of depression that's created by pumping in this stream, but not de minimis wells. And the court didn't say what a de minimis well is. The court said, that's for all of these things, determining what is the subflow zone, determining what is the cone of depression, and determining what are de minimis wells. That's work for the Department of Water Resources. Just go to it, DWR, easy peasy. So that's part of the, that is really a Herculean task for DWR to have to complete. And by way of illustration of how complicated it can be, here's a wonderful graphic. This is a cross section of a stream system, and it shows wells A, B, C, and D. And so you can see that there's a subflow zone. This is the saturated floodplain Holocene alluvium, this light blue area. And you can see that all of the water that well A is what's withdrawing is subflow. But look at well B. Well B is withdrawing water from beneath the saturated floodplain Holocene alluvium. And it doesn't appear, well, maybe withdrawing some subflow. Well C is withdrawing water that would otherwise, it looks like it would otherwise reach the river, and it's withdrawing subflow, but it is more in a cone of depression. And well D over on the left side does not seem to be withdrawing subflow at all or in a cone of depression. So it's a good illustration of how complicated this can be. It's especially complicated in certain watersheds. I'm told by hydrologists that, for example, the Verde is one of the most complicated watersheds hydrologically because there's so much variation. So it has become an incredibly difficult task to work out what is subflow, where is the subflow zone, what do you do if a well in the adjudication is pumping subflow, if part of the water that a well is pumping is subflow and the rest isn't, what do you do? Do you just limit the amount of water that can be pumped, or do you shut the well off completely? These are all questions that have yet to be decided in the adjudication. In 2013, the adjudication court judge was hearing from parties in the adjudication that it was taking too long. and he invited them to brief him on what were the problems in the adjudication. And the conclusion of months of briefing was the law surrounding subflow has proven to be the root cause of delay. And in 2013, Judge Brain said, but the good news is we've almost finished delineating the subflow zone of the first watershed in the adjudication, the San Pedro watershed. And he said, it'll probably be, we'll probably get through the San Pedro right away now. Well, DWR has been working very consistently on developing the subflow report, but it wasn't until 2017 that the subflow delineation for the San Pedro was completed. So a very, very complex task for the court to complete. Is it terrible that it has taken so long? I would say no. The water rights for the San Pedro, as are the water rights in any watershed, are some of the most important rights. They have to do with people's livelihoods, with people's homesteads, with businesses, with areas that Arizonans appreciate for their beauty and special values. And it's super important that great care be taken to be clear on where is the subflow and who has rights to the water in the watershed, and what is the seniority and all of the other attributes of those rights. Now, the court is working away in the San Pedro watershed. Just in the last adjudication bulletin, which comes out quarterly, it's just such a good read. The court announced that the Verde watershed is going to be treated differently. Instead of one big subflow report, the court has decided to break the Verde into sub-watersheds and have a subflow zone delineated for each of the sub-watersheds. And the court has basically asked the department to provide a report on how it's going to approach these new subflow delineations, and by next year, just about this time next year, that report will be published, and the parties will have about 6 months to file objections. And the court's going to start with the Sycamore subwatershed, and then Lower Verde Valley, and then Little Chino. The timeline is mapped out all the way out till 2028, believe it or not. But it'll be interesting to see if it goes faster, because the court's breaking it up somewhat. There's a chance that it will go faster. So that's why it's taken so long. So what are the implications of this 40-something-year-old adjudication? I would argue that delay means uncertainty, and delay makes the problem worse. If we could have snapped our fingers in 1974 when the Gila watershed adjudication had been filed and somehow sped up the process so that had been done in just a few years, I think everyone would be better off, because we would have known who had what water rights, and we would have been able to do deals that help get people to new uses for water that really aren't feasible right now. And instead, what we've had, and I'm going to pick on the Verde Basin here, but what we've had, unfortunately, is a lot of well development without the certainty that we would like to see in this context. So this is just a series of slides that will show. This is from the ADWR Wells 55 database, which is a pretty good proxy. This is how many wells were in the watershed in 1919. And now in 1974, when the Gila adjudication was filed, we had over 2,300 wells. All right. Now, this is when it's known that there's basically an adjudication, a fight over water rights, or a proceeding to determine water rights. In 1987, when the subflow issue was raised, we're up to almost 7,500 wells. This is the year the subflow issue was raised, and people arguably were on notice at that point. In the year 2000, when the court issued its decision on subflow, there were by then over 13,000 wells. So almost a doubling of the wells since 1987 when the issue was raised. And in 2017, 17 years after the court has issued its decision on subflow and put everyone on notice that some wells may be regarded as surface water rights allocators, by that point we had another 4,000 plus wells in the Verde Basin. So we can look again. I have similar graphics for what's gone on in the San Pedro, in the upper San Pedro. In 1974, when the adjudication was filed, about 1,400 wells. When the subflow issue was raised, about 3,600 wells. In 2000, when the decision was issued, putting the state on notice that wells near streams or in cones of depression would be treated as surface water rights allocations, we were up to 6,000 wells. In 2000, I don't know why I have 2005 here. There's some reason. But in 2017, we're pushing. Now, will all of those wells be in the subflow zone? No, I'm not saying that. Are they all going to be in the cone of depression? No, they aren't all in the subflow zone or in the cone of depression, but many, many are. And as I've said, we do have a tendency to drill wells near streams because that's where the water is. And so a great deal, a great number of those wells will either be in the subflow zone or in the cone of depression, and their impacts to those water users. I remember I gave this presentation to the Governor's Water Council, and then I was invited to come give it to the Farm Bureau, and Stephanie Smallhouse said, particularly talk about that case with the funny name, and the case is Tattersfield versus Putnam, which is a case from 1935, which seems to say that as of 1919, when the state adopted its surface water code, you couldn't, if you drill a well and you haven't perfected your right according to the requirements of the surface water code, you can't date your diversion back to when you drilled your well. So a lot of parties in the adjudication think that Tattersfield stands for that this is this old case, but essentially you might have moved in to the Verde Valley, let's say, in 1932 and drilled a well and irrigated your farm all those years. One group of parties in the adjudication say, we're not going to treat that as a 1932 surface water allocation unless you went through all the formalities that are required by the 1919 code. And so basically you're out of luck. That's the contention of one group of parties in the adjudication. That's a great deal of exposure for some people who rely on well water. Now, the reality in the adjudication is that in many, many instances in the San Pedro, where there are contested cases being essentially settled, claim after claim after claim being settled, the parties are looking at a lot of these wells and saying, this is just a change in the point of diversion. You were diverting from a stream or a river, and then you drill the well because that diversion was inconvenient, and we are going to think of it as a change in a point of diversion, and we are not going to have a fight with you over your right to that water. So the parties are treating it differently than might be treated if we wanted to have a sort of, all-out fight over this. Any questions about all this so far? Is it making sense? Okay, I got a nod. I think I got a nod. Okay, so why is it important to resolve the adjudications? For the state, it's really important for the state because we're at a point where we are looking at a decreased supply of Colorado River water. We're in a long-term drought, which has impacts for water users all over. We have some communities that are growing. We have some water users that may be interested in a reallocation, in a water rights transfer that would earn them money and give them some kind of security and give another party some water to use. And as the Department of Water Resources and the Governor's Water Council has acknowledged time after time, as in the case of the Governor's Council's long-term water augmentation options report, until the adjudications are resolved, we can't identify strategies for getting water to people. What we have is, as my slides show, continuing reliance on wells by people who probably don't even know that there's an adjudication going on. And so it's a messy situation that's not good for water planning and for water security for all of those thousands and thousands of claimants in the adjudication who are the little guys and gals. There's another reason why I think it's really important that we resolve the adjudication, and that is that there's a sort of idea that it's really hard for a court to cut off someone's water supply. And it's just so hard to tell a little property owner, like, no more water. And so the more and more people who move in and just rely on water that they, really should not be relying on, the harder and harder it is for the court to resolve the situation. So it's time to get a grip on it. And there are many strategies for ensuring that water users have sufficient water. We just can't implement any of those strategies until we resolve the adjudication. Before I even came, I'm the first director of the Kyle Center, but before I came, there was an adjudication reform committee pulled together, and it's basically like 45 water lawyers and then a few water experts thinking about what can we do, what could we do to speed up the process of the adjudication. And so in the process of that work, we published a report, The Price of Uncertainty. We promised to publish, but haven't quite published it yet, a report called Investing in Certainty. So The Price of Uncertainty explains the adjudication and shows that for investment in a region, there needs to be clarity on water rights, and that there are some places in the state that where there isn't that kind of clarity and certainty that are at risk for becoming known not to be good investments. I should say that by the same token, there are places, and I can point to the Verde Valley, where there are lots of people. I was on a call today with an ag group, and this group of people said, we want to have farming and we want flows in the Verde. Both of those things are important to us, and we know we can do this. But the reality is there can't be a hope for sensible, sustainable management of a river like the Verde if we don't resolve the adjudication. The key, the pathway to having a community work together to have what they want in the way that I heard today is to resolve the adjudication. And so we've also been doing ongoing outreach on the adjudication. I'll skip through this because I talked about that already. Yeah, so part of what we did in the Price of Uncertainty report is we interviewed real estate developers and corporate site location consultants and asked them questions about what do you think about in terms of water before you decide to invest, or when you're thinking about making an investment in water. And it might, what we found is that they really do know that water is an issue in the West, and the adjudication really could get in the way. So I sort of skipped through that so I could get to what I think is more important for you all. And that is there anything we can do to resolve the adjudications, or do we just have to wait for it like a big, steamroller to come and roll over us? Because I think that's the feeling that a lot of people have about the adjudications. And the fact is that it isn't the case that there isn't an opportunity to resolve claims. In one of the things, maybe the only thing we've accomplished in a formal way in the Adjudication Reform Committee is that when we started, there was no procedure for the settlement of non-federal claims in the adjudication. So if you're a state law claimant, you had no opportunity to settle your claims and get out. Think of it. I mean, thousands of people, no opportunity to get out of the adjudication. It's still the case that you don't have an opportunity to get out, but our group came together and over seriously years, developed a proposed procedural order for how to settle state law claims. And then some of the parties submitted that procedural order to the court. We're still waiting for the court to decide on whether or not to implement it. But if it is implemented, then state law claimants will have a vehicle for settling and getting out of the adjudication. We've also talked about different concepts for how you could settle claims in the subflow issue. And to move that along, we pulled together a group of water managers who would think more practically and not so much like lawyers. And we came up with a formal concept for addressing subflow. And the key concepts that they developed were to grandfather current well owners and limit the development of new wells, but allow well owners to have a transferable well right. So that was their big concept. Just stop the wells at where they are and give well owners a right to sell their well right or move their well if needed. Another concept that's not captured here is that communities would need a water budget that would allow for some amount of growth. A lot of the communities that have their kind of a finger pointed at them in the whole issue of growing on groundwater have actually made huge strides in conservation. And those people at the table who represented those communities in our water managers group said, you shouldn't punish us for all the good work we've done and give us a little bit of budget for growth. So that was part of the concept. And there was also some discussion about mitigation programs. So a water rights holder, let's say, has a big surface water right and isn't using it all or doesn't need to use it all, could essentially put some of that right in an escrow or an exchange program, and somebody could buy that right and use groundwater in proportion to that right. So that's a kind of mitigation concept that's out there as a settlement concept. It's hard I think it's really hard to get our arms around these things, but I really have a hope that we're not too far away from having some communities have a discussion about these kinds of vehicles for settling the adjudication rather than waiting for the great big steamroller of the adjudication court. So in the years that I've spent on the adjudication, I've kind of come to these conclusions that I want to share with you, and then I would love any questions. I think that the biggest barrier to resolving the adjudication currently is people's lack of understanding of it. It's a very understandable lack of understanding, but without a doubt, there are ways we could settle claims if people felt they could and had a better understanding. Without question, nobody benefits from any delay in resolving the adjudication. The people who have strong surface water rights don't benefit. The people who move in tomorrow and drill a well don't benefit. No one is benefiting from the adjudication taking a long time. It needs to be resolved. And finally, we could make this go faster. We have one part-time judge as the judge for both of the adjudications, the most complex legal proceedings, certainly in the history of Arizona, maybe in the history of the United States. One part-time judge. He has one special master who's basically a junior judge who does fact-finding, but every one of the special master's important conclusions winds up being retried in front of the adjudication judge. And any big conclusion, some of her small conclusions people don't contest. If we need more investment, we need a full-time adjudication judge. We need at least one more special master, and they need to have a staff of paralegals who can help develop the contested cases so that with an understanding of what are the rights at issue, what's happening on the map, so that the appropriate cases can be pushed into settlement discussions faster. So that report, Investing in Uncertainty, didn't happen because we wound up publishing a different report. But that's really the argument that the Kyle Center will be making soon. There's a way out of this that doesn't involve the steamroller and doesn't involve 20 or 30 more years of litigation. And we should be focusing on those rather than lying down and waiting for it to happen very slowly, the slow torture. That's what I have for you. I apologize again for the crazy interruption. Here's my contact information. I'd love to hear from you. And also the maps that I was showing you come from an interactive tool. This is the link. You can email me if you want. You can go on it and play around with it if you're interested. And I hope I can come back and talk with you soon about the Kyle Center's new, exciting new tool, the Arizona Water Blueprint, a totally different subject. Any questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, and I'm glad you touched on a little bit. One thing that, you know, in this whole water adjudication, well, there's a couple of things, which of course you alluded to, you know, it'd be better when no one wants to delay this. But in our situation, the problem is we don't want to delay it either, but it's a huge financial burden on us in agriculture. And, you know, it'd be great if I had millions of dollars and I could hire you and all kinds of whoever good lawyers to, you know, to solve this. But that's one of the issues with us as producers. And secondly, it's very frustrating because, like you mentioned, that the Verde along there, well, you can't have, you know, agriculture and have the stream flow, and I'm not, you know, familiar with the vegetation and so forth at the Verde. But one thing I've seen over the years is fifth generation and studying the history of this river. We're fighting all this fight, and if we're gone, the farmland is going to come in with solid mesquite, and mesquite's a phreatophyte, and it uses, I guarantee it's going to use way more water than what the farmland was using. And as a matter of fact, you know, with I know this, I mean, it's not just science, it's also firsthand knowledge. Growing up as a kid, we used to use when our diversion would get low, my dad would always say, well, as soon as the first freeze, it would dry up, completely dry up. As soon as the first freeze hits, the mesquite will lose their leaves and we'll get a full ditch again, or we'll get quite a bit of water. And sure enough, and as soon as the mesquite, you know, put leaves back on, we'd lose our water. And then we've seen where we've cleared out farmland, my dad did, and the river started actually running again. And it's really not native to this river valley, but no one wants to talk about that. And so we're going through all this money and fighting, and you may have disagreement or people may disagree, but that's not being talked about at all, is the vegetation that's going to come in when the farms are gone, which a lot of them are gone. And the river has way less water than when they were here. And,
I think that's an important point. In fact, this coming Friday, that committee of the Governor's Council, the Long-Term Water Augmentation Committee, and Steph is on that committee, is going to be talking about phreatophyte management as an augmentation strategy. But we couldn't even have a management strategy without resolving the adjudication. I mean, you're saying if the farms are gone, then there's no one to manage the encroaching mesquites, and I get that point. But
exactly.
even if we decided, here's the strategy, you know, let's talk about the Verde. We're going to remove the arundo, you know, an exotic plant. You can't even implement a strategy if you don't have clarity over water rights. And you don't know who's going to benefit from a strategy if you don't. So it's an important point. There's definitely a role for farmers in the management of riparian habitat, without question. To your first point about the financial burden, you know, I think it's hopefully there are some ways. It seems to me that there should be ag groups that are willing to be there for the first cases, because those are the cases that are going to set the precedent for the rest of the adjudication. But I would say it's even worse for the little well owner or the little domestic user who has, I mean, there are many people in the adjudication who have zero capacity to be represented, and they're, you know, it's a bad way to decide water rights. I mean, it's unfortunate. In the last session, it didn't get off the ground, but there was interest in developing through the extension service some support for water users in the adjudication that would give water users, you could go to your county extension and you could get information about your water rights claim sufficient to fill out your, you know, to sort of defend yourself. I thought that was a really interesting idea, and one that it, you know, we had proposed, the Kyle Center had proposed that we ask both law schools to develop clinics that would be pro and low, they call them low bono clinics, where you could have law students supervised by water lawyers, you know, assist in cases for low fees or no fees. I think that's part of, you know, those kinds of programs should be part of our discussion, because I feel for you. I know how much you guys are involved in what you're doing, and I feel for producers and others who are having to incur huge legal expenses.
And it's not, I don't think that individual, well, you know more than I do, but the individual small well owner is going to be affected like we would be affected, and they're not, I mean, who's really going to be affected is the bigger farms, I think, at the end of the day. And so, you know, it's a huge, you know, we've been fighting it for 40 years, and it's a huge financial burden. And I mean, it's, I'm glad, like you said, I mean, I think it'd be great. I don't want my kids to have to fight all this too, and have some certainty. It's hard not to have certainty on, you know, our farms and so forth. But at the same time, you know, it's easy for people to say, you know, let's get this over, let's get this done with, when they don't, you know, have the financial burden that we do. I mean,
yeah, there's no question a huge burden. It's just, is it less burden when it's long and drawn out? You know, how many generations of your family has been in the adjudication at this point? 3 at least, right?
Yeah. But it's just, it keeps changing. Like when I asked them, well, what about when they were doing the Gila water adjudication? Well, what about the other tribes? So no, we went through all that, and then now, you know, we've signed a treaty with the Gila Indians. Now it's the San Carlos Indians. It just seems to never end.
Yeah, so. It's a very, very difficult situation. And wouldn't it be better if you could have a settlement that, I mean, that's kind of our big point. Couldn't we be talking about full-scale settlements instead of settling this federal claim, that tribal claim? Couldn't we be thinking more broadly about how to get people out of the adjudication in those, you know, and so that's kind of what our concepts are about. Turning people to think about options rather than defending.
Yeah, and I wish Bill was on too. I was trying to explain to him about the difference between groundwater and surface water. The groundwater, at least with the surface water, there's a, you know, first in time, first in use, the grandfather rights. But with the groundwater, as far as I know, the state has all the claims to the groundwater, and there's no, I mean, I guess there was a recent decision, or not decision, there hasn't been any decisions, but there's no precedence on, you know, how are they going to decide that? They don't even have rules on how, who's going to get precedence or not, right?
Yeah, there's, outside of the active management areas, there is virtually no regulation of groundwater. And so except where we have this interface between groundwater and rivers. Then there is a bunch of people who are relying on groundwater who may be found to be relying on subflow. But outside of that, the subflow rule, there's virtually no regulation of groundwater in the state. And that's, again, we're seeing people who are saying their wells are going dry when some big new user moves in, typically big new agricultural operation moves in and drills, you know, deeper wells. But yeah, that is outside the adjudication. It's probably the most serious water issue in the state.
Like I said, I could ask questions all day. I'm still not learning. Now you see why I was confused. Bailey was trying to ask me this stuff when you went off. Well, what are you facing and how's it going? And well, I really
Good
don't
questions.
know. That's a good question. That's right.
Yeah,
I can't tell you.
Yeah.
Good, bad.
Yeah. Well,
financially, it's not going too well.
no one likes to pay for a lawyer. When I was a lawyer, I was a defense lawyer, and it was like, oh, I'm like the oncologist. I'm the doctor you never ever want to have to go to, much less pay. No one wants to pay a lawyer to, you know, in the adjudication. But the court is moving through the Redington subwatershed pretty fast. That's the one you're in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the court is trying to move through. And the thing about our current special master is that she really gets that it's best to try to settle cases to the maximum extent possible. Now, while the parties can basically now come together and agree on a settlement, they can't settle out of the case. They can't get a final determination by the court until our procedural rule is implemented. But they can basically reach a settlement in a way that is meaningful to the party, where the parties that matter, that might contest it, can come in and agree. None of that will happen until the federal claims are quantified. And so, you know, I could talk about the adjudication all day, but there's a big federal claim in the Redington subwatershed, and it is tried. The court has taken all the evidence it needs to about that claim, but we're waiting for the court to issue a decision quantifying the claim and describing the claim. That once that happens, there will be a lot of clarity for the state law parties, like the small houses, to be able to reach, hopefully, settlements with all of the meaningful parties. And so there were 4 total federal claims in the San Pedro watershed. They've all pretty much been tried, but we're waiting. And honestly, you know, nobody has any idea. We're waiting for them to be quantified by the court so that we have that important clarity to move on to the state law claims. And the same thing's going to happen in the Verde.
Yep.
So I really,
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I appreciate the chance to speak with you all. You can read more about the adjudication I can send Sharma the links to our 2 reports, or I can send you copies if you're interested in reading more.
Sarah, sorry, one question. And I know Chris is on the line, and Stephen Williams is the chair of the Santa Cruz NRCD. Yet was unable to make it, but he was asking about, do you know about the Bureau of Land Management claims over the San Pedro and what's going on there? I know you talked about the San Pedro.
Yeah, for the Sprinka. Yeah, that's one of those. So the claims, that's one of the claims that of the 4 big federal claims, and I believe it was the last federal claim to be tried. And I think it's either completely tried, meaning the court has taken in all the evidence and arguments about it, or it will be completed by this fall. And so then the court will have heard, and the reason for approaching it this way is that federal claims have special sort of super attributes. They usually have, like, there's no forfeiture of federal claims, whereas we all know that there's forfeiture of a typical surface water right. It's use it or lose it, right? Federal claims aren't subject to forfeiture. Federal claims can include groundwater, so they're different. So the court said, well, we'll hear the federal claims first, and we'll quantify them, and then we'll move on to the state law claims. And we're almost at the point of having, or we have taken in all the evidence and all the arguments of the federal claims, and we are all very hopeful that the court could actually issue a decision, but it hasn't happened yet.
Thank you, Sarah. Any other questions for Sarah? Well, I wanted to say a couple things. One, Sarah, thank you for telling me about changing my name in the box, because I don't know if you've noticed, I was able to do that. You guys, I'm learning Zoom just as we all are, and yeah, so I didn't even know how to do that, so thank you. But I wanted to say, yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for taking this time to talk with us, and I wanted to let everybody know that the ASU Kyle Center for Water Policy is a big partner of the AACD, and a great proponent for agriculture, and you know, we're working on a lot of stuff with them, so very excited that they're on our side, and thank you for taking that time.